we don't train models on publisher data. We don't fine-tune models on publisher data. If you are a creative, and I think news in particular fits this, and you are selling your voice and style as training data, that you're misaligning incentives with the person paying you. And so I don't think that's a healthy future, because so much of what makes journalism valuable and unique is actually the voice and the style of the writer and the author.
Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast that explores how AI is changing media, journalism, and content creation. I'm Pete Paschal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot, and I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people building how the business of news will work in the future. So this week I'm thrilled to talk to Cory Ondrejka. Cory is the CTO of Smart News, which you may know is one of the few news aggregator apps that's actually had some success. It's wildly popular in Japan, and it has a pretty good US following as well. And now, with the rise of AI, Smart News is getting another crack at reinventing news consumption, and it's taking it with a new app called NewsArc. NewsArc isn't quite an aggregator. It's more of an AI-powered news curator. Instead of using LLMs to summarize news, it instead uses them to understand news events. Then, once it's taken in all the stories on a topic, it picks the best story that will improve your understanding of that topic. So it's designed to inform, not take you down rabbit holes of outrage. At least that's how Cory describes it. But how does it do that without biasing you one way or the other? And how can that kind of curation model go beyond mobile app experiences, which, let's face it, aren't exactly the hotbed of innovation they once were? We get into all of that. And along the way, Cory taps into his experiences with Meta and Google to diagnose what's wrong with news feeds, and how to create a new model that helps us move past them without getting lost in a sea of hallucinated summaries. We might even get a little optimistic, so look out for that. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you do, I'd also be grateful if you leave a review for this podcast. Reviews, especially in Apple and Spotify, really do help the show, so please leave one if you can. Also, a couple quick notes. First, I'm offering a monthly class on AI for beginners. It's only 60 minutes. And like everything I do, it's focused on practical takeaways for media professionals, people in journalism, PR, communications. And it's only $49. Each one's a live class, so it's always up to date, and I guarantee you'll walk away with something you can apply to your day-to-day. You can sign up at mediacopilot.ai. And for deeper training on AI, I'm offering 2 6-week courses that are starting in October. One's for journalists, and the other's for PR and comms. They're each loaded with lessons on things like deep research, how to automate workflows, and building your own agent. You can sign up for those at, where else? mediacopilot.ai. Okay, now it's time for my conversation with Cory Ondrejka, CTO of Smart News. Cory, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Thanks so much for having me.
Cool. Well, we're super thrilled you're here because I need you to help me figure out how I should be getting the news. I know you've worked at Google and Meta, so you have pretty keen understanding of how people use platforms and consume news, I guess. Though one of the things that's interesting about now and why the Media Copilot exists to a large extent is a lot of that playbook from the last decade is getting thrown out as generative AI slowly takes up more and more of, just the world. So we're throwing out some old models. People are getting summaries via podcasts and aggregated apps, and certainly, all the things that AI is enabling. So you're with Smart News, and Smart News, I understand, has kind of a solution for this. I guess it's a new app called NewsArc. So news apps in particular, have a bit of a checkered past, I guess. Spin-off apps, maybe even more so. So I guess my first question right off the bat is, why is it a second app, this NewsArc, and what problem is NewsArc solving that Smart News couldn't?
So a lot of questions in that run up, and let's take them in reverse order. Fundamentally, a lot of my last couple decades in technology have been focused on attention. right? Even if I go all the way back to video games and Second Life, attention and how people are spending their time is a really important part of what I have been doing for a long time. And if we go back to sort of the invention of the modern feed, really the 2012 when we started getting targeted advertising coming into feed experiences, really optimized for mobile, and that was at Meta or Facebook at the time, but Meta now. And one of the ongoing discoveries of the last decade since that invention is that mixing news and attention reinforcement feeds is really, really problematic. And particularly environments like the United States, where you have so much polarization and outrage becomes such an easy hack to grab attention. It becomes the simplest way to say, why try to convey something important or true or critical to you when I could just make you mad? And in feeds and attention reinforcement feeds, where those models are just going to try to then serve you more of what you engaged with, what you find in attention reinforcement feeds is it's just very, very difficult to do news in the United States and a lot of Western Europe where we have polarization and outrage so dominating the discourse. And what we set off to reinvent about 2 years ago when I left Google and joined Smart News was, could we deliver news in particular in a way that was resilient to outrage capture and resilient to this sort of attention hijacking that we see? And the reason for doing it in a new app is I think a lot like the experience at Facebook from that era where, Facebook has Facebook and Messenger and Instagram and Threads. And why wouldn't you have different apps and different products to address different audiences and to explore different things? And particularly in NewsArc's case in Smart News' case, where we have an app that's very established in Japan and does very well in Japan. And Japan, we could talk about the media market's pretty different than the US. That product is really good for Japan and is pretty successful in the US as well. And so rather than trying to disrupt those users who are pretty happily on Smart News, we said, look, let's just build something up from scratch that takes advantage of all of the technologies you were starting to reference in your intro that, in my mind, make it even possible to consider doing a different approach to ranking that just you wouldn't have even considered it 3 or 4 years ago. And that's NewsArc. NewsArc is not attention reinforcement. It is about respecting your time and attention and saying, look, you're somebody who's interested in the news, who wants to really understand efficiently the big picture of what's going on, the complete picture of a story. We do our best to deliver the right articles to you to solve that need.
Nice. So let's get into some of the details of that. Like, I definitely understand it conceptually, but how does it do that? But also, moreover, like in terms of the not going down sort of the either the outrage rabbit hole, as you described it, and just having a healthier experience. But beyond just how does it do it generally, like how does it do it better than, say, a more generic AI search engine or information portal?
So let's go through those individually because they all approach news really differently. And like search in particular has always sort of struggled with news because what the signal characteristic of news is that it's new all the time. And when we think about what really transformed search 25 years ago with PageRank and then everything that came after that was you're building up this graph structure of quality and attention for the entire internet and you're using that to guide searches along with a bunch of other signals. But it really relies on a certain amount of stability to knowledge graph and a certain amount of stability to the internet. And for news, you often don't know what to search for. So as a consumer of news, search is a kind of an awkward starting point. So that's the search case, which is why feeds took over, right? Feeds were invented to deliver sort of modest signal to noise ratio content to you, and to give you a way for you to act as the filter, right? Particularly when we reinvented the feed in 2012 for the revamped mobile experience, where we rebuilt all of Facebook's mobile apps and took them from being sort of crashy and slow and buggy to actually really, really solid and good. You could then get a feed really quickly. You could sit there and you could scroll through it really quickly. And so you act as the filter on that. And particularly when feed was still sort of mostly what your friends were doing, the sort of attention reinforcement ranking models worked really well because all of the, like, your friends aren't trying to hijack your attention, right? Their
Right. Sure.
incentives aren't misaligned with yours. I mean, you might
Depends
have
on your
some
friends,
friends
I
who
guess.
are,
But
but
yeah.
like we know which friends those are. So,
Those of us
uh,
in the business might be
a,
encountering that, but I hear you.
100%. There was a moment at Facebook when Open Graph allowed you to share your music listening experiences,
Oh
and let me
God.
tell you, having worked
Yeah.
at EMI and having a bunch of friends in the music business, the hijacking of attention with who was listening to either the best or worst music was just off the charts.
That
Um,
actually, that sort of auto sharing got me to not use Spotify for something like 10 years.
it it was one of these very, and we could do a whole 40 minutes on
Yeah,
Facebook and
sure.
Facebook's approach to sharing, and it always was this, well, maybe people would want to share this, so let's try it. And then if you had a bad sharing experience, you do exactly what you just did, which is like, thank you, no. And so attention reinforcement models, which are sort of the classical ML from the late aughts through the teens, right? So these are where you build a deep learning model. Ultimately, you then keep updating that deep learning model with ongoing data from usage, and that model just continues to optimize and optimize and optimize. And it is very, very effective at delivering you more of what you just clicked on. And again, that's why it's so susceptible to hijack. The other thing that a lot of us have experienced, particularly in news apps, right, is you click on one story, and then for the next 3 days, your feed is just flooded with stories like that. And you have this moment as a user of, well, how do I get out of this trap? And so that was the sort of the teens to recently era of conventional feeds.
Right,
And
exactly. What you described there is, as Facebook pioneering sort of spread everywhere, and now it just seems like it's gospel in terms of engagement.
everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Because you're all these use cases where you have comparatively low signal to noise ratio content, and you have a lot of content and you're trying to deliver it to people, often on a phone, right? So you don't have a lot of pixels available to you. So feeds are a very natural model for that. And we watched, I wasn't at Facebook at the time anymore, but you watched Facebook make a couple real runs at news. They built a big team in New York. They really went after this. And every time it was like, no, this doesn't make for a feed that is sustainable. And I think you see that reflected in US engagement with news, right? We're now at like 42% news avoidance in the US, where, an American, if polled about this, will say, sometimes or often I avoid the news. And that's the environment we were stepping into. So what's changed? Well, what's changed is the emergence primarily of large language models. And I'm going to differentiate a little bit between some of the use cases you talked about on the generative side, and just talk about
Right.
LLMs for a minute.
Okay.
LLMs, and I'm sure you and your listeners are really familiar, are models that are trained on it just inconceivably large data sets, primarily of people's writing on the internet, right? So they're trained on actually a lot of news data, a lot of other writing, a lot of internet. Uh,
A lot of
the
Reddit posts.
Reddit posts, the USPTO is another one, right? And and all of that data means that what LLMs are actually shockingly good at is something that we would previously have called like natural language processing. Natural language processing emerged sort of in the aughts as a way to do like sentiment analysis, right? When you had those first moments of, if you were building your brand on the net and somebody said, hey, I can bring you a service that will tell you whether people are agreeing or disagreeing with you. And that was NLP and sentiment analysis. And it was better than anything that had come before, but it was still like 65% accurate. LLMs are spectacularly good at this. LLMs
Okay.
are spectacularly good at entity extraction. They are spectacularly good at reading documents and then telling you, how would an American have responded to this? The predictive ability of that question to an LLM is actually very, very strong.
So what does all this mean for the feed and the
So
approach to
what this
news
means
and
for the
smart news?
feed
And yeah,
is, um, rather than thinking about this as a build a massive ML, classical ML model, it is instead, can we go look at every article that we look at, and we look at tens of thousands of them a day from hundreds and hundreds of partners, um, for a given category of news. Is this a well-written story? Is this a high-quality story? Is this story likely to be intentionally polarizing? Is this story, what category is it in, independent of kind of where in the publisher's catalog it sits? Questions like, what are the claims in this story? It's funny, you often hear people talk about like facts from stories, and that's really not how we think about it. We think about it as claims. A
gotcha.
news article, particularly as it first comes out, is making claims about the state of the world. And extracting claims from a story, again, is something that an LLM can do very, very well. And claims start allowing you to have a sense of, well, which article got the story first? Because sometimes it's not the latest story, it's actually the first story. And you can actually watch kind of the blast wave of not just syndication, but of stories getting reflected in later stories as they come out. And, there's a big wave early in the morning on the East Coast of the US, and then there's sort of an afternoon wave. And if there's a big news event that happens, that comes out. So we start having a very sort of human editorial viewpoint on all of these articles. And what that lets us do is rather than saying, hey, we're going to try to synopsize this article for you, which we actually did about 2 years ago, because we're kind of wondering like how that would feel if you synopsized or bulletized. And what we found is LLMs were really good at that. You have hallucination issues that you have to build systems to protect from, but they're really good at that. But we actually found it not super compelling, as opposed to, can you give me the best article about Gaza today, or the best article about the CDC today? And can I then give you, let's say you want to read more than one article, or you want to go a little bit deeper, or you want to understand if there is a difference in viewpoints on this, then I can give you the second article to read. And so we present this in NewsArc as the daily dozen. At any
Sorry.
given time during the day, we are picking the 12 stories that we think for an American would be the 12 stories you need to know about.
And
And
these are
for
all like
each,
separate topics. These are all
they're
like,
all
okay, these
they're
are
all
the
separate
12
news.
things. This is like your front page.
That's exactly right. And
Right.
we think of them as news events, and news events can have like hundreds of articles written about
Yeah,
them,
of
and they
course.
can change over the course of the day. And part of what we spend a lot of time in tech on is actually identifying in a very editorial like way. And we actually have journalists and editors who help us write prompts to make sure we're getting these things right. And we backtest with humans reviewing whether we're actually getting this right. But if we can actually track a news event over the course of the day, one, we can suppress the hundreds of articles that come out that are just duplicates, because something that happens, and again, not just syndication, but there are a lot of articles that will get created that don't materially change your knowledge of the story.
Right.
And,
True.
and they're
But right.
interesting because they kind of give us a sense of like importance or popularity, maybe, but there's no reason for you to read 50 of them, right? And
Right. Let me make sure I fully understand what you do. So you
yeah,
got your dozen articles. This is the front page, but for each of these topics, your LLM system is selecting the best article for me. Like, but this article is not a summary, right?
correct.
This is something that's like, oh, the best one for Pete today on whatever topic. This should be from the Atlantic or the Journal or the New York Times or whoever your partners are. I guess it's got to be
And
from
even
within
and
that.
even more strongly than that, we're not selecting the best one for Pete. We're selecting the best one for an American news consumer.
Got it.
Because there's another piece about news that feeds has really broken, which is news is itself a community activity, right? News is something where having shared state about what is in the news and what is being said about the news is actually really important to how we all communicate about the news, how we go through our day. And because feeds basically ensure that you get a completely unique view on the news, uh, we actually think it's pretty important to go in a different direction from that. Now, what we also allow you to do is to say, hey, what topics are you interested in? And so within the Daily Dozen, if you decide like, hey, I like NFL, I like sports racing, I like cooking, I like travel, we will serve you up what we think are the best current articles on those topics as well. And the one other piece you sort of said article and topic. I will keep using the term news event because I think news event it's bigger than an article, but it's smaller than a topic.
Right.
Right? You think about the CDC has had a shockingly large number of different news events around it in the last several weeks. But each of those we think of as a news event, and how we sort of approach that is how would an editorial board at a newspaper think about it, right?
Right.
Would
Okay.
they treat it as an event over the course of 1 or 2 days, or maybe even just half a day? And
Hmm.
so within that event, we will give you what we believe to be the best article for you to read right now. And then we will give you 1 or 2 or 3 additional articles that our system believes will add to your understanding and are worth reading. And
Got
if
it.
and if we don't find any other articles, we'll just give you one and we'll say like, no, this is the article to read. And if you read this, you can go to the water cooler. You know what needs to be known about this particular news event right now. 4 hours from
Interesting.
now, it might be different.
So tell me a bit more about if this approach. I'll give you a scenario, and you
Yeah.
tell me if it's like how it would deal with that, or maybe even NewsArc might not even be the thing I might want to use for this. So, oh my God, big thing I'm really interested in, whether it's something serious like the CDC stuff you're talking about, or maybe it's like Taylor Swift and
Yeah.
Travis Kelce, and they
Totally.
just announced, and I want to go down this. I'm just like, this is my jam, and I want to really fully get into this. You mentioned if I do, it's going to recommend article after article that is appropriate for having a greater understanding of this. And there's at some point there's a limit to that on whatever topic it is, no matter how intense I am. There's going to be like, yes, you've done 30 articles on the Taylor Swift thing. We're done. Like you're going to have to go somewhere else for more of it. I mean, how does that work?
So there are a couple different places that we would catch that. Something we haven't talked about yet is so there's 3 surfaces in NewsArc. There's the top news where the dozen and your topic interests are. There's collections that we can talk about later, but it's basically it allows you to sort of build your own custom magazines out of
Gotcha.
whatever sources we have. And then there's variety, and variety is actually the most agentic part of our system right now. Because after we do all of this ranking and all of this connecting and all of this mapping of claims and everything else, what we do then is we turn agents loose on it and say things like, you're producing, a weekend entertainment section. What interesting things are happening right now? And what tends to come out of that is it finds that Taylor and Travis are engaged, and it finds the hundreds of articles around it. And then it takes advantage of all of that ranking work that we have done and will surface it in a section that might have somewhere between 3 and 10 articles there waiting for you. Um, Almost like a mini newsletter. It isn't a newsletter, but it's that sort of same, hey, this thing's happening. You might not have heard about it, or maybe you have heard about it. Here's a bunch of different things around it you can read. And we have been really, really thrilled by the results that we keep seeing in Variety, because by having done all of this work to turn the ever changing world of all of these, tens of thousands of articles we get every day into a structured view of what is happening in the world right now. And to be clear, when we say news, I love the Taylor Swift example, right? Because news is hard news and soft news. It's all still news, right? It's still, professionals are out there reporting on it, and doing their best to convey what they think their audience wants to hear about it, what they think the most important, aspects of it are, the claims are, et cetera. And so, um, what NewsArc doesn't do yet is I want to just keep going
Right.
on this topic. I think that is something that we're very capable of doing, but you always have to be, particularly when you're launching, you have to be opinionated about what the product is and isn't.
Yeah, you use the
And
word magazine. Is it
yep,
fair to say that that's kind of what the experience is intended to simulate? It's like it is more of a I'm leaning back into this experience and trusting the thing I'm holding. I'm just sort of imagining someone literally leaning
yeah,
back in an easy chair, but I'm trusting that this is going to be a good curated selection of things, and I'm going to spend some time here. It's not like an experience that you might say in a feed or a website or whatever, where I'm just kind of sort of jumping around. It's not really meant for that. Is that
well,
sort of
what
fair to
we
say?
see
Or
is, I'd say it's a tiny bit more nuanced than that. People tend to approach news with different goals at different times of the day. Uh,
interesting.
and there's again, I'm going to hyper generalize for a moment. There's you've just woken up. What is
Yeah,
going on? What do I need to know about?
sure. Give me my NPR summary or whatever it
A
is.
100%. And our dozen is very, very scannable if you don't want to go click into the stories and you just want to say, like, what is going on, including all those other topics that you're kind of interested in. So it's like, wow, this is a feed, but it's all stuff I'm really interested in. And so we see a lot of start of the day scanning of that. And, then you have a break midday or you want to go a little bit deeper on something. For a lot of people, it's later in the day is well, I actually do want to go find the Atlantic article that's referencing this. And this is one of the really real powers of building it the way we have is that we'll have a story that is, the news event that's happening right now and, shocker, a lot of times there was an Atlantic article from 4 days ago that's 10,000 words on this topic that you actually probably could go read if you really wanted to go deep on it. And we'll often find that and be able to associate it. So you see the main article is the short, punchy today's article, but then they sort of go deeper and then the Atlantic is sitting there. And so it gives people a little bit of choice around what sort of experience are they looking for in that moment. And we tend to see people coming back multiple times a day and taking these different paths. And so collections is very much the build your own magazine. Right. And so if you've always dreamed of like if I could just have, Road and Track plus the Atlantic plus the Verge, we actually let you do that.
Right.
And then all of that is still ranked by all of these systems that we have running underneath. And that ends up often being a really, really fun kind of lean back activity where, well, this is all stuff I wanted to read anyway, and it's kind of there and you can go a little bit deeper. So the app is trying to cater to people who are engaged with the news. There are a lot of Americans you see it this show up over and over again in survey data who really do want to be interested in the news. They want to be connected to it. They want to have as much as they can find, an unbiased view. You see a lot of cross shopping of news sources.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
so it's where I think aggregators have an opportunity, um, though I think what we're doing is in a lot of ways less of an aggregator because we are then doing this picking and choosing. But what's great as a reader is we're often kind of surprised by like what article will pop as the one who got the story first and the story we want to go in and read. And then we go spelunking in and go look at other stories and ask our journalists and editors to go reading. And quite regularly, we then come back and go, "Nope, that was the story to read." How I would not have guessed that that would have been the first source.
So when you said earlier you were really pleased with the results you were seeing, particularly I think in the collections, well, what results were those? Is that sort of the response to it, the quality of the selections of the LLMs? What has been the most positive result that you've seen?
So I think it's all of those. I think it's the LLMs driving it, but then when we see in the data people who come in for just that initial news fix of like what's going on, and they skim down through the dozen, but then they wander over to variety, and then they bounce over to collections. And seeing people who clearly have an interest in news and journalism, often, again, often not just hard news, because nobody can just read hard news all day long. That would be too hard on anyone. And and we had imagined as we were developing this that we would be really, really good at delivering. If you want to build a magazine that is celebrity news and media, like, my guilty pleasure is film news. I love film news. I'm just a total fanboy about movies and cinema. And so being
That's
able to just build a custom construction of movie news feels really good after reading about the CDC. You can kind of bounce over and read something else.
so is the behavior, the KPIs or whatever, however you think about it, significantly different from smart news itself? And did you hit the things that you were aiming for when you built NewsArc? I know hasn't been that long, but
It's been
you know,
literally 3 weeks. I mean, come on.
yeah.
So really, really good question, and I think it's one of the hardest things when you sort of branch off of a really well-established product, particularly with something that visually feels and looks similar at first blush. And it's why we keep talking about it as it's an agentic news app, it's something different. It's very easy to fall into, well, we're just going to import our metrics from the old system and try to beat them. And to be clear, we have done that because everybody manages that way, even when I stand up and go, well, whatever we do, let's not do that. So we do that, and we're seeing metrics that we view as very, very positive compared to our usual metrics. But what we're also seeing are these longer journeys through the product, and not just journeys that are just sitting there, sort of scrolling in one place, but journeys that take into deeper runs into content, more, I think, articles that I would view as more interesting, that clearly the readers are viewing as more interesting. And so we are, yeah, we're pretty excited about what we've been seeing so far. And obviously, like, it's summertime in the US. This is a very quiet time, though in a lot of ways that was intentional because we had been, using this ourselves and using it with friends and family. And you get to a point with a new product where, look, you're pretty sure product development is always this. I mean, like creating anything, right? It is this knife's edge balance between unbelievable hubris that you can put something out in the world and anyone will care, and complete humility, because guess what? The users are correct. They can't tell you what they want, but they are correct if it's not working. And you don't get to go negotiate with them. Like, don't you understand how cool this is? And so we've gotten to a point where what we saw with friends and family was pretty compelling and convincing to us. And so it was time to start getting strangers in the product and getting to watch what they do.
Nice. Yeah, well, speaking of negotiation, I'd love to just chat a little bit about the publisher side of things.
Yeah.
So obviously, you guys have existing relationships with news providers. Gives you guys a bit of an advantage, I would assume, as you sort of rethink things in the LLM era. But as you've just described everything, and that it's not just or summarizing things and using LLM generated stuff. It sounds like that might have been an easier conversation with publishers, and like, we're going to do this new experience, but we're actually going to be serving up your content, without the summarization part, even though we're using LLMs in other ways. Is that fair to say that hasn't been as a big an issue? But also, I guess my main question is, does the model differ significantly from what you're already doing with smart news, which I think was more of a, like, you're featured and you get your stuff. It's almost like a Google model in a sense, but just with a feed. Correct me if I'm wrong though.
Well, we pay our publishers for all their content. Like,
Okay.
Smart News that's been a big part of Smart News for a long time. It was actually, when I first met Ken, was something where I'm like, that seems actually really clever as we start moving into an LLM era. And it meant that we've spent a long time in the US building really trusted relationships with these partners. And what it allowed us to do is very early on go to them and say, first off, we'd like to do some more more typical sort of summarization and bulletizing, all that. Like that's what everybody does
Sure.
first with LLMs.
Hmm.
And we got additional permissions from enough of our publishers to go do that work. And then a few months later, we actually went back to them and we're like, this isn't actually very compelling. And so it was a very interesting moment, and especially because like all the publishers are experimenting also, right? They
Yeah.
all have, generative AI steering committees. They're all everybody is exploring this space at the same time. We've then been showing publishers NewsArc, and what has been on the one hand kind of remarkable, and then on the other hand actually not at all surprising in hindsight, is they all get it.
Hmm.
And I think the reason is fundamentally publishers thinking from an editorial mindset. An editorial, you are always thinking about like not just what are the news events today, but what order are we going to put them in? What story are we going to lead with? Why are these two stories next to each other, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly here we are doing that across many, many publishers. And at every step of the way, really respecting that, sure, LLMs can go produce prose, but we're really fortunate to have thousands and thousands of journalists writing, the very best of these articles. Let's go use math to figure out which ones to put in front of people, and let's help more people be more connected to the news that they really care about and the information they really care about. And so far they've been really, really good conversations. And, I think that as we continue to move forward, again, we're really lucky to be able to have conversations with publishers about, well, we think this next step might require us to rethink a piece of our deal. But from the beginning, we were very committed to fairly compensating them because, look, if we don't have publishers, we don't have a news business. And that's a really bad place for all of us to be. So we feel, again, pretty fortunate to be a part of that ecosystem that is respecting publishers, respecting the readers who so want to be connected to this content.
Cool. So, like, as we sort of wrap things up, I kind of, this is just to summarize, honestly, to summarize, because your LLMs aren't doing it, I got to do
Yeah, I
it.
know, I know.
But it's like, but that's kind of the point in that news arc isn't. It's incorrect to call it a summarizer. It's not even really quite an aggregator. It's more of a AI powered, supercharged news curator
Hmm.
for a non and no, without engagement as the main driver. Not to use your descriptor already, but it sounds like, if you were quote unquote smart, and
Well,
that you want your smartest mix of stuff that is going to keep you informed, not outraged.
that's right. And I think, look, we want to be engaged with meaningful news, right? News matters, news journalism matters, news is important. Engagement isn't bad. Engagement that's hijacked by outrage is pretty clearly terrible. And so being able to not go down that path and then instead be very focused.
Well,
And
let me click on that just a bit,
yeah,
okay, and push back maybe a little bit in
yeah.
that, certainly as we talk about hard news, there's going to be things that are serious. There's going to be polarizing topics, different political takes, certainly, and to some extent, bias within the sources you're talking about, some large, some small. So as you figure out the best thing to put in front of someone, how do you balance all that? Like it could, if you choose a certain source, whether, I don't want to pick one, but you could pick one that is at least regarded as left or one that is regarded as right, or, and if like basically how do you do that, particularly with these sort of serious topics that the story itself may not be super biased, but the following it sort of encourages bias. You kind of know what I'm getting at, right? I mean, it's
No, I do. I love
how do you figure that out?
I love this question because I think it exposes the fundamental challenge that particularly in the United States we are all operating within. And the first one is that there is this sort of agreement that the fundamental way to think about truth and facts and news is through this lens of left versus right. And having now spent a lot of time actually looking at the claims and articles, looking at what journalists are writing, and you let out with hard news, so let's be really specific about something. There are many organizations that have a news division and an opinion division. And if we talk about the news division, when you go look at the details that are in the stories, what will surprise you is that some of the perceived as most polarized publishers, if you go through same day stories for both of them and look at the claims, they
A lot of
match like
agreement. A lot of
95%.
agreement. Yeah, I
No, it's not a
agree.
lot of agreement. They match like 95%. And there are like introductory sentence might be different, concluding sentence might be different. There also might be big editorial decisions about where in the page it gets served. But again, we're not reacting to that. We get to go put it where we think it's the most important. And so I actually don't think that starting from political bias is the right starting point when we're talking about delivering news. Now, sometimes, like particularly when you move into like opinion sections, absolutely. But let's be clear, opinion is a different thing than news. It's still news. It's still super interesting. And I think having an ability to be like, I want to subscribe to a bunch of opinions, great, go do that. I think as a reader, that can be really, really enjoyable. And you'll see way more differentiation there. But those aren't, if we're talking about, a hard news story, those aren't the articles we're drawing from. There are biases, right? And there are differences. But sometimes it's like urban reporting versus rural reporting, or it is the first story versus later stories, um, but it isn't, it's not always as simple as left, right. And second, what we have seen is it's really not accurate to call particular publications, particularly for their news divisions, just simply left or right. It's just much more complicated than that, and it tends to differentiate per topic, per week, per when the owner is sitting around in the editorial boardroom, like, and you really see these sort of ebbs and flows. And so instead, we look at it at the claim level, we look at how claims flow out. And I think over time, something that we will be able to do is really talk about sort of perceived political bias in reporting versus sort of what we see in the results. And that's not something that we're doing yet, or certainly not something we're putting out in front of people yet. But I think it's really interesting, and it's why we intentionally, because we, again, 2 years ago, we did the experiment of like, what if we just looked at every story, with a left-right lens, and you could put a slider and you could do all of those things. And which is what we found is that wasn't an illuminating way to understand
Yeah.
the story.
I've definitely seen variations of that all over the place, and it's ostensibly a good tool, but you kind of wonder, is it solving the right problem? And it sounds like you're taking it from a different approach and also willing to evolve. I guess I'm really
And what I would say,
curious.
sorry, not to interrupt,
Yeah, go ahead.
apologize to interrupt, but like if we find in a story that there is a left-right bend,
Hmm.
like we will put up one story and then there will be a second, because again, the system tends to find when you need a second article to get a complete view of the claims.
Hmm.
And so there are times where that could be a political difference. But again, just as often, it's it's a different underlying driver. And I just think that makes it much more compelling as a reader.
Yeah, I'd be curious if the metrics that the LLMs are looking for the best possible story do tend to favor certain outlets. So that, oh, these ones tend to be the most accurate with their claims, they tend to be the most comprehensive, etc. So you're probably aware of a site called TechMeme, right?
Mhm. Yeah, of
And
course.
it tends to favor all certain outlets. And while people in the business often claim bias, and maybe there is a very strong case to be made. And I know Gabe, and he makes the case, and it's that Gabe, who's the in charge of TechMeme, in that it's just good content. They're really just looking for certain criteria, and the best stuff rises to the crop, and they tend to be similar outfits because they're just great reporting on particular things, which is hard to argue, because it's like, you look at someone like Mark Gurman, he's getting scoops all the time on Apple stuff, right? It's, of course he's going to be there all the time. So, and that sort of translates to publications. Does the same thing happen? I mean, again, 3 weeks, so who knows? But I mean, like, are you starting to see that this sort of happens or no?
What we've seen, and because again, we've been looking at it for a lot longer than 3 weeks, is that because news has so many verticals within it, um, within individual verticals, you'll see, okay, these are the 30 publishers that tend to be rotating through out of the hundreds and hundreds, or maybe the 10 that rotate through. And certainly like the wire services tend to be faster because that's part of what they do, right? Their job is boom, we are hitting the story right as it comes out. And again, it's been illuminating to see how fast sometimes and how complete some of these very early wire stories are. And so we will often be like, nope, this is the right one to read. It's concise, it's well written, and it got all the claims, and it was, 20 minutes ahead of everybody else. But then you get into, again, particularly as you get into stories that have to build over a longer period of time or are more narrow or niche, it's often a surprising and very different publisher who our systems are like, no, 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 go read this one. And so we do keep being surprised by that, and then not being surprised once you go in and do it. Because look, we've certainly seen this in other domains, like podcasting is a great example. Newsletters are great examples, right? Where folks who get very, very specialized often become very, very good at what they are reporting on. And why not have systems that can go find them? Not because every reader is always interested in everything from that source, but because sometimes that specialized source actually reads against a larger story or a topic that you're interested in. And that's really a lot of the magic that our approach brings to the surface, because you're going to discover, stories you wouldn't have found before. And our hit rate is very, very high on, if we tell you this is something that is worth reading, we're pretty committed to not wasting your time. And so far, we seem to be achieving that.
Nice. I know we've talked for a while, and I kind of feel like I go down a lot of these different rabbit holes with you, but I would like to just sort of get sort of a forward-looking perspective on where you think not just NewsArc is going, but news consumption is going. I just want to zoom out a little bit. So I guess you could sort of say news apps on the sort of continuum of ways people consume news are sort of in the middle, right? You could have big general engines like whether it's ChatGPT or Google or what have you over here, and then you have websites, publisher websites on the other one, which is like I'm very specifically I'm going just to the Atlantic or the Times or whatever, and then a news aggregator or news app is sort of in the middle. Um, do you see that ever becoming a larger portion than it is? And this is sort of my question about not just NewsArc, but smart news. Or do you see them as kind of like more niche for news junkies and sort of tasteful, which is fine, right? Like I feel like a big vision of the future of media actually is kind of like it's all going to be a bit smaller in some ways. It's going to be a little more niche and apart from sort of the big picture summarization. Maybe that's wrong. I don't know. But I want your perspective on that. Like, where do the apps like Smart News and NewsArc fit in the ecosystem when AI is a chief mediator? And then how does it look if it's healthy? Those are kind of
Yeah,
like
no,
two-part question, but it's important.
no. So
Like versus,
that's a nice second part of that question.
yeah, well, it might be helpful to paint the unhealthy version at the same time. So
No,
anyway.
that's right. And I think, again, I tend to like to start from what are the things we know or think we know. And and I'm sure you have dived into this multiple times. Reuters does an annual digital news survey that is sort of the gold standard on worldwide survey data on news consumption. And when you look at the US through a lot of different lenses, you keep finding, on the order of 80 to 90 million Americans who really, really, really want to be engaged with the news and are really, really frustrated with their current options. And that is a huge chunk of the adult American population. And it's what gives me hope that there is a very healthy version of the news ecosystem that's still out there. We've just been operating for the last decade with the wrong products and the wrong delivery mechanisms. And so when I think about something that is healthy, I think that it has a few dynamics. One, I think it is really important that publishers and journalists are actually delivering what they create to the people who want to consume it, and they want to read it or listen to it. One of the things that we're quite outspoken about is we don't train models on publisher data. We don't fine tune models on publisher data. Feel pretty strongly that if you are a creative, and I think news in particular fits this, and you are selling your voice and style as training data, that you're misaligning incentives with the person paying you. And so I don't think that's a healthy future, because so much of what makes journalism valuable and unique is actually the voice and the style of the writer and the author. And that's something LLMs are remarkably good at imitating, and imitating really credibly. So I think, as much as, like, again, LLMs are really good at summarizing. So of course we have a million summarization things going on. Sure. Um, I don't think that's the healthy long-term version. I think curation is likely to be more important. Now, where I think it gets a little bit blurrier is in areas like translation. LLMs are actually making translation just better than we've ever had available to us, cheaper, faster, basically above human quality. And, particularly in the US, like, I would love to have more access to Spanish language news in the US. I am not a fluent Spanish reader or speaker. There is a ton going on in the US that reads against populations that are communicating and writing to each other in a part of the news that I don't have access to. LLMs could open that up in ways that I think would be really valuable in all directions. And that's not quite summarization. It's kind of in the same category, but it is something that seems very, very valuable. I think that's really important. When I think about the big LLM companies, they obviously are enjoying a worldview that is all experience gets subsumed by a chat interface.
Right.
And they have a bunch of really good reasons to be going down that path and pushing really hard on that path. I think the reality is not every product should be a chat interface. NewsArc is a really good example of this. We are extremely agentic. We could not exist without being powered by LLMs, and there is no free text interface in it. There may be one in the future, but, like, I'm not sure that the first way you get your news should be dependent upon, "Good morning, assistant, give me my news." Like, I don't need to say
Well, and
that. I can just open it up, right?
even if it is, the morning's one part of the day, as you said earlier.
A
It's
a hundred a
probably a
hun
completely different
100%.
thing I'm hunting for afternoon, etc.
100%. And so, to me, it is, how do you unlock that community of news consumers who are just frustrated right now? And, like, if you go look at Europe, you find a very similar cohort of people who are like, they care about the news, they historically have paid for news, they have historically shared news, they listen to news podcasts, and they're frustrated and they are avoiding the news. And the driver for that, I think the clearest single driver for that, is polarization and outrage, and finding ways to actually curate the news that doesn't leave you feeling, more unhappy than you need to. Like, look, if you read a sad story, it's okay to feel sad, but you shouldn't just be bombarded with sad things, because that's what generates clicks and that's what generates ad revenue for everyone. And so
So, but is
that is my
curation the answer with something like NewsArc, right? It sounds like it is, but it's
well, we
like
believe it's the
you
first
need,
step, right?
yeah.
And it's the first step, along with fairly paying for the content. I don't think, like, another, you had said, like, what are some bad views of the future? Like, being dependent on traffic is a bad
Hmm.
view of the future.
Sure.
Like, I think everybody has hopefully learned the lesson that just traffic isn't the right model. Because, again, incentives are misaligned. I can build a better experience if I keep you within NewsArc than I can taking you to a mobile website and trusting that the mobile website isn't a disaster, except
Right.
most of them are. And the way to do that fairly is I should be paying for the content, which is what we do. And that model and making it better as AI continues to get better, and being able to deliver it on better devices and being able to bring it to people where they are during the day. Like, I think that's a pretty compelling way to go reach, both in the US, Europe, to go reach these, very quickly get to hundreds of millions of people. And if we did that, like, we would have a profoundly healthier news ecosystem. And I don't just mean big publishers. I think everybody who's participating in news should want to be able to plug into curation, so long as it's a fair exchange of value and it is something where they're getting paid for their content in order to be reaching people they might not otherwise reach.
Nice. Yeah, I'd almost see it like something like it's almost like Apple CarPlay in a sense, right? Like or Google. I guess I forget what they call theirs, Android something. But it's like it's a better.
Android
That is
Auto.
it. It's a better experience than what the car folks were serving up for the longest time, which was a disaster. But the thing is, you need to figure out a way to extend that ecosystem, and it's sort of, I guess, you could think of it as curation, curated set of abilities into something that is not traditionally there. And that's kind of what I was getting at with like the app versus these two ends of it. If that experience is what the thing that's really going to help people and be the thing that improves, all those metrics, I think the key is then just sort of extending it to those other two ends of the continuum I sort of threw out there.
I think that's right. And particularly, like, we always talk about it as sort of branded news. So the singular, like the New York Times, the CNNs,
Yeah, sure.
right? Like, they are very, both, they benefit and are constrained by their editorial viewpoints. And what is delightful about getting to be in the middle is we get to then have a really great relationship with them. We get to be partnered with them. And we don't limit for our readers what their editorial decisions are limiting for theirs. And so it ends up being this
Right.
experience that feels much broader, which again goes back to, we have a news audience who is struggling with trust. Well, what are the reasons they struggle with trust? Well, if they don't agree with the editorial decisions or they're surprised by them, it's this other place where you see trust eroded. And I think we have an opportunity in curation to be really transparent about how we are making our decisions, and then to build trust with every time you click into a story. Is it a story you're like, this article's really good, I'm really glad I read it?
Nice. Yeah. The more that happens, you could fix some things.
That is
Cory,
the
we could
goal.
go on for hours, man, but I really appreciate you coming and taking the time and sort of breaking down not just what's going on at Smart News with NewsArc, but just, some of the things that are really afflicting and affecting the whole, media and news community. So I appreciate all the insights.
Well, Pete, thank you so much for having me, and hopefully we'll see you on NewsArc.
All right. Thanks for listening to my conversation with Cory Ondrejka of Smart News. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you'd take just a minute to leave a rating or review for the Media Copilot in your podcast app. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Media Copilot newsletter and check out MediaCopilot.ai for our classes on AI for journalists, PR professionals, and communicators. Be seeing you in the future.